No one saw it coming. At least, not like this. It was an ordinary morning in Washington. No scandals in the headlines, no whispers in the hallways, just the quiet hum of routine politics. The country moved along, unaware that a fuse had just been lit. Then it happened. A single public statement, signed by a sitting Supreme Court justice. Clarence Thomas, 33 years on the bench, had decided he'd had enough. He released a statement not just defending the court, but attacking a sitting member of Congress by name. Representative Jasmine Crockett, the statement read, has shown herself unfit for office. Her reckless rhetoric and disregard for constitutional boundaries present a threat to the balance of power. For the good of the nation, she should resign immediately. The words spread like wildfire. Cable news cut away from their segments. Reporters scrambled. Social media exploded. A Supreme Court justice, the longest-serving member of the court, had called for the resignation of a first-term Congresswoman. Unprecedented. It wasn't just a political shot. It was a declaration of war. And what Clarence Thomas didn't know was that Jasmine Crockett had been waiting for this moment for months. Jasmine Crockett wasn't new to fights, but this one was different. She had built her career from the ground up. A civil rights attorney from Texas who'd taken on police departments, school boards, and corrupt officials before she ever walked the halls of Congress. And she didn't scare easy. She'd faced down Chief Justice Roberts just a few months earlier, had held her ground when others backed away. But Clarence Thomas, he wasn't just another political figure. He was power, legacy, the robe, the bench, the voice behind rulings that shaped generations. But that didn't intimidate Crockett. If anything, it focused her, because she knew something most people didn't. She had the file. Months earlier, her office had quietly begun gathering information. Financial records, travel logs, messaging data, communications between donors and court officials. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even personal. It was about accountability and the truth. What began as curiosity had grown into something bigger, something dangerous. A trail of luxury trips paid for by billionaires, private jets, unreported gifts, political phone calls during active cases, and most importantly, the texts. Clarence Thomas had made mistakes, and now Jasmine Crockett held them in her hands. All she needed was a reason to go public, and Thomas just handed it to her. Crockett didn't rush. She didn't post a thread. She didn't go live on Instagram. She simply made a short announcement to the press. Tomorrow, I will respond to Justice Thomas with facts. That was all she said. Washington held its breath. Reporters begged for leaks. Political operatives placed calls. The court issued no comment. And behind closed doors, Clarence Thomas believed, truly believed, that this was just a bluff. He'd weathered worse. He'd been through confirmation hearings, scandals, and editorials. One press conference wouldn't shake him, but he had underestimated her. And worse, he'd underestimated the moment. Because this wasn't going to be politics as usual. This was the start of something else. The room was full. Cameras lined the back wall. Every major network had gone live. Even international reporters had flown in overnight. At exactly 2:00 p.m., Jasmine Crockett stepped up to the microphone. She wore a navy blue suit, the same one she'd worn when she stood her ground against Chief Justice Roberts. A quiet symbol, a reminder. In one hand she held a folder, in the other a tablet. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't smile. She just began. Justice Clarence Thomas has called me unfit to serve. Today I'm going to respond, not with opinion, not with commentary, but with his own words, his own messages, his own voice. And then she opened the folder. The first document she read was a text, a short message sent from Clarence Thomas to his wife, Virginia Ginny Thomas. Crow says the RV loan can be structured as a gift. We'll never have to pay it back. Private jets good to go for Bali. These people take care of us. The room fell silent. Then came the next message. This time, about a luxury fishing trip in Alaska, paid for by a billionaire real estate developer with active cases before the court. He said we're welcome anytime, no paper trail. And then, the one that changed everything. Voting rights case goes up next month. Harlan says the outcome could affect his interests. Let's talk before the conference. Reporters started shifting in their seats. Some gasped. Others simply stared. But Crockett wasn't done. She had more. And this time, she pressed play on the tablet. The voice was unmistakable. Calm, measured, judicial. Clarence Thomas. If we don't shut her down now, she'll inspire others. You want to protect the court? We have to destroy her before she gets traction. A pause. Use the media. Use the donors. Break her momentum. It wasn't just corrupt. It was strategic. And it wasn't speculation anymore. It was real. The room exploded, but Crockett stood still. She let it settle. Then she said, Justice Thomas says I am a threat to constitutional order. I say he's a threat to democracy. Outside the Capitol, the air had shifted. Word spread fast. Protesters gathered. Some held signs demanding Thomas's resignation. Others called it a political hit job. But everyone was watching. Inside Congress, members of both parties were quiet, not out of fear, out of calculation. Everyone wanted to know, was this real? Could she prove it? And by the time Crockett finished, no one was asking that question anymore. There were no leaks, no anonymous sourcing, no gray areas. She had read the justice's own words, and more than that, she had captured his voice. Not the one Americans had grown used to hearing from the bench, not the silent, stoic figure in the robes, but the one behind closed doors, the one who joked about liberal tears and never paying back favors. The real Clarence Thomas. What followed was immediate. The headlines were relentless. Justice exposed. Crockett drops the hammer. Texts, tapes, and the end of an era. That night, even the most loyal defenders of Thomas paused. Cable networks aired panel after panel of stunned legal experts. Former clerks, former friends. Conservative talk radio hosts who had long revered Thomas now spoke with hesitation. The next morning, the court released a short statement. Justice Thomas was reviewing the allegations and would respond in due course. It didn't come from him. It came from his spokesperson. That detail didn't go unnoticed. Neither did the silence from the other justices. For years, they had protected one another, kept public criticism to a minimum. But now, sources began leaking. Private meetings, angry calls, warnings. Chief Justice Roberts, who had once tried to block Crockett from testifying months earlier, was said to be furious. He'd lost control of the court once before. He wasn't going to let it burn this time. But the damage was already spreading. By that afternoon, journalists were reporting on more than texts. They were finding real money trails, backed by Crockett's research. Private security fees paid by shadowy PACs. Unreported property transfers. Shell companies connected to friends of Thomas's wife. The pieces were coming together. And suddenly, it wasn't just about ethics anymore. It was about potential crimes. Across town, at the Department of Justice, phones began ringing. People wanted answers, and they were going to get them. That evening, Attorney General Merrick Garland stepped in front of the press. Without naming names, he confirmed that the department was opening a formal investigation into possible judicial misconduct involving financial disclosures and public corruption. It was the moment everything changed. Because now, it wasn't just a political scandal, it was a legal one. Behind the scenes, the pressure grew louder. Within Congress, members whispered about impeachment. Some openly called for it. But Jasmine Crockett didn't wait for them. She made her move. At a podium the next morning, she stood tall, just as calm as the day before. Justice Thomas made the first move when he called for my resignation, she said. I'll make the last. Today, I'm introducing articles of impeachment. She wasn't shouting. She didn't need to. She had the country's full attention. Within hours, more than 100 members of Congress had signed on. Even some Republicans were quiet, because no one wanted to be caught on the wrong side of a scandal this big, not with this much evidence. And for the first time in decades, the outcome wasn't uncertain. It was inevitable. Thomas had to go. Still, he resisted. He agreed to one last interview. A podcast. Friendly territory. He thought he could explain himself, paint it all as a misunderstanding, but it backfired. When the host asked about the RV loan, Thomas said, "That was a private conversation. Even if I said those things, it doesn't mean they're illegal." The damage was instant. He'd confirmed the texts were real. That night, Senator Mitch McConnell, once one of Thomas's strongest allies, issued a statement. Justice Thomas's own words have made his position untenable. And just like that, the wall cracked. It didn't take long to fall. 5 days after he had demanded Crockett resign, Clarence Thomas resigned instead. A one-page letter. No apology, no explanation, just an ending. After 33 years on the court, I am stepping down. I thank the American people for the opportunity to serve. It was over. The man who had spent decades shaping the court had been brought down, not by a rival justice, not by a political machine, but by one woman who refused to be silent. Jasmine Crockett stood before the press that same evening. She didn't smile. She didn't boast. Instead, she said simply, "No one is above the law. Not in this country. Not anymore." Then she walked away. But the story wasn't over. What came next was change. Real change. What happened next didn't feel like politics. It felt like a shift in gravity. Clarence Thomas's resignation wasn't just a career ending. It was a break in the story of the American judiciary. For over 30 years, he had shaped decisions on race, voting, money, power, and now, gone, overnight. The court had never lost a justice like this, not to scandal, not to exposure, not to the slow erosion of credibility. It had lost him to the truth. The reactions came in waves, first from the press, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, even Fox News. They all said the same thing, in different words. He had to go. The evidence was too much. Then came Congress. Over 150 Democrats signed on to Crockett's articles of impeachment. But what mattered more were the Republicans. Quiet at first, then suddenly clear. Senators like Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, Mitt Romney. They didn't hesitate. "The evidence is overwhelming," they wrote. Justice Thomas has violated the trust of the American people. But the sharpest blow came from within the court itself. Behind closed doors, the other justices were furious. They weren't defending him anymore. Not after the texts, not after the recording, not after the podcast. Chief Justice Roberts delivered the message personally. Resign now, or face public censure. Thomas got the message. So did the rest of the country. The Justice Department moved quickly. Garland confirmed it publicly. An investigation into possible bribery, tax evasion, and financial fraud was underway. And Clarence Thomas wasn't a justice anymore. He was a suspect. Investors noticed too. Companies linked to his corruption, donors, developers, private jet owners, saw their stock prices drop almost immediately. The markets responded to ethics in real time, and for once, ethics won. But perhaps the biggest ripple came not from Wall Street or the court, but from people, voters, citizens. Americans across the country began to talk about the Supreme Court in a new way, not as something sacred, not as something distant, but as something human, flawed, and fixable. At town halls, in classrooms, online forums, people asked, how did this happen? How did it last this long? And more importantly, what do we do now? Jasmine Crockett had an answer. She didn't stop after Thomas resigned. She kept going. At her next press conference, she laid out a plan, a full ethics reform bill for the Supreme Court itself. Term limits, financial disclosures, gift bans, independent audits, mandatory recusals, public oversight, the Supreme Court Ethics Act. And this time, the country was listening. It passed the House, it passed the Senate, and it passed with bipartisan support. Why? Because no one wanted another Clarence Thomas. The act created the first ever Office of Judicial Integrity, an independent watchdog for the court. It wasn't just reform, it was reinvention. The court had been changed, not from the inside, but from the outside, by a woman who refused to accept silence as tradition. And that was only the beginning, because Clarence Thomas's resignation opened a door. President Biden now had the chance to appoint a replacement, and this time, it mattered more than ever. The ideological balance of the court had tilted. His nominee, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, was confirmed in a razor-thin vote. She became the first black woman to serve with a liberal majority on the bench. For the first time in half a century, the court leaned progressive. The rulings followed quickly. Voting rights were restored. Corporate loopholes were closed. Environmental protections were upheld. It was as if a legal storm had lifted, and in its place, clarity. But change didn't stop at decisions. It reached into classrooms. Law students now studied the Thomas case as a warning, and the Crockett method as a model. Courses were redesigned. Professors rewrote syllabi. Entire institutions admitted their own mistakes. The honorary degrees, the unquestioned invitations, the blind praise for a man whose conduct had gone unchecked. Yale Law, Thomas's alma mater, created the Thomas Center for Judicial Accountability, ironically named, perfectly timed. And across the country, students saw the message, the law is not untouchable, it is a living thing, and it can be challenged, when necessary, by truth. Jasmine Crockett became more than a congresswoman. She became a symbol. Time magazine named her Person of the Year. College campuses invited her to speak. International groups studied her approach. Young activists quoted her speeches. But she didn't run for president. Not yet. She stayed focused on policy, on oversight, on unfinished work. Because for her, this wasn't about power. It was about restoring trust. And that trust? It had been broken for a long time. The fall of Clarence Thomas proved something most Americans had quietly feared, that power, left unchecked, could rot even the highest seats in government. But it also proved something else, something better, that power can be reclaimed. That truth, when spoken clearly and backed by evidence, can bring even the most insulated figures to account. And that justice, real justice, doesn't come from robes or titles. It comes from courage. And Crockett had it in full. The ripple spread further than anyone expected. Across oceans, headlines lit up. The BBC called it the fall of a justice. Le Monde called it a democratic earthquake. In South Korea, in Brazil, in South Africa, Crockett was front-page news. Not just for what she revealed, but for how she revealed it. With clarity, with proof, with precision. At international legal forums, she was invited to speak. Her method, the use of digital evidence, cross-referenced records, and open communication, became a model for other nations. In places where corruption had long been shrugged off, her story sparked new investigations. In America, it did something even deeper. It shifted the culture. For decades, the Supreme Court had been viewed with reverence, as something above it all, unreachable, untouchable. But the Thomas scandal cracked that illusion. It showed that justices could be flawed, deeply, intentionally flawed. And it showed that accountability didn't have to stop at the courthouse door. That realization changed the public conversation. People no longer whispered about ethics. They shouted. Voters began demanding judicial transparency the same way they demanded campaign finance reform or voting rights. And more than ever before, they paid attention. They watched court hearings. They read decisions. They asked questions. They wanted to know who's funding these decisions, who benefits. And slowly, the system responded. Lower court judges began disclosing gifts preemptively. Law schools required new ethics training. Bar associations toughened their standards. But the cultural change didn't come from institutions. It came from people. Because for many Americans, this wasn't just about law or power. It was personal. They had lived under rulings shaped by Thomas's hand. Activists who'd lost environmental battles. Voters whose districts had been redrawn into silence. Teachers, nurses, parents, all affected by decisions made by someone who, it turned out, had long ago stopped serving the public. And now, hearing his texts, hearing his voice, they felt something rare, validation. For years, they had been told they were exaggerating, that their concerns about corruption were conspiracy, that judges couldn't be bought, that ethics violations were technicalities. Now they knew the truth, and that changed everything. The hashtag Thomas texts trended globally. Clips of Crockett reading those lines, about never paying it back, about making liberals cry, spread across TikTok, Twitter, YouTube. They became viral proof that the emperor had no clothes, and that people, even in the face of great power, could still speak the truth and be heard. Students wrote papers on Crockett. Artists painted murals. Podcasters unpacked every word of her speeches. She became more than a congresswoman. She became a movement. But she never lost focus. While the world watched, she returned to her office and kept working. She pushed through the second phase of the ethics bill, expanding oversight to federal judges in lower courts. She partnered with tech experts to create open-source tools for tracing political influence. She trained younger members of Congress on digital accountability. And slowly, something began to form. A new way of doing things. Less secrecy, more sunlight, not perfect, not fast, but real. And that was enough. In homes across America, the shift was quiet, but deep. People began to believe again, not in perfection, but in the possibility of reform. They saw a woman stand alone, take on a giant, and win. Not by yelling louder, but by preparing better. Not by playing the game, but by changing it. The fall of Clarence Thomas wasn't just the end of one man's legacy. It was the beginning of something larger. A new standard, a new expectation. That power would answer to truth. That evidence would outweigh status. And that one voice, when backed by courage and clarity, could still shake the foundations of power. In the final months of that year, Crockett gave fewer interviews. She spoke less, not more. When asked why, she smiled. The work is louder than the words. And then she returned to it, because justice wasn't a moment. It was a process, and she was far from finished.